I am by no means any expert on Ashkenazi genealogy, but it's a subject that interests me. And I know that a lot of people have ancestry in both communities. And by both communities, I mean Western Sephardic, that's to say sort of Portuguese Jews, and Eastern Ashkenazi, that's to say from the Russian Empire. And my own ancestry on my father's line, obviously I'm descended from Anglo-Sephardim who've lived in England for 300 years and had originally come from Portugal. The Anglo-Sephardic community quite early was encouraged, notably by Sir Moses Montefiore, to marry Ashkenazim. There had previously been sort of prejudices about that. And in my families, I have ancestors who are quite early Ashkenazi settlers in England, presumably sort of Dutch German. And indeed, my own grandmother paternal grandmother was born in Warsaw in Poland and brought to London as an infant. My mother's side is Lithuanian Jews who came to Manchester in the mid-19th century, which is to say, I have foots in various camps. I was naturally drawn to Sephardic genealogy. Obviously, if you grew up being called Mendoza, which is quite an alien and unusual name in this country, and you belong to a Sephardic synagogue, halachically I'm Sephardic, and so it was the obvious focus of my research. And I've been a bit slow in researching my Ashkenazi ancestry for reasons that we shall discuss as we go on. So meet Anshul, and Anshul has been already pretty well photoshopped. I'm hoping to have further photoshopping to open his left eye. And Anshul Feingold is my great-grandfather. And the reason he's looking less than his best is this is a few days before he died of syphilis. But this is the only image we have of him, and I actually think I look quite like him. So I need to try and clean it up a bit. We don't know very much about him. We assume he was born in Poland, possibly in Warsaw. We believe he was a jeweler, possibly a silversmith. We think he was married to my great-grandmother, but various relatives put question marks over that. And we know he died in London in 1913 of a social disease. So if you look at the right, what we have here is a page from the Catholic baptismal record of the Church of San Lorenzo in Jaén in southern Spain. And here we see the baptism of my direct ancestor and namesake, David Mendoza. He was baptized under the name Antonio. And we know quite a lot about him, thanks to these Catholic registers and Inquisition registers and so forth. So we know from his baptismal register roughly when he was born, and we know his parents' names. From the Inquisition records, we know that the family had come to Spain from Portugal, and this was almost certainly after 1580, when Spain had annexed Portugal. We know the names of at least some of his siblings. We know that he worked as a maestro de armas, a fencing instructor, and we know various places he lived in Spain. We know he was arrested by the Inquisition in Cadiz, taken to Seville, where he had his auto de fe, his sort of trial end of Inquisition process, was put in an open prison there from which he absconded. We know that from there he somehow ended up in Amsterdam a few years later at a family wedding, and we know the precise date several years after that on which he was paid, he and his family, to go to London, and we know the date of his burial in London. which is to say that David lived around 250 years before Anshul, but we know infinitely more about him than we do about Anshul. And whilst we have Anshul's photograph, indeed we have from the Inquisition, we have a description of David. And this is really going to be one of the themes of this discussion, that there is just infinitely more information available for the Sephardic researcher. And we were saying, of course, that David was living 250 years before Anshul. And here, just to illustrate this, we've got two pictures. We've got Charles II of Spain, known as Charles the Bewitched, who was the last Habsburg king of Spain, a consequence of too much intermarriage between that family. And on the right, we have Alexander I, Tsar of all the Russias. And it was in Alexander's reign that Eastern Ashkenazim living in the Russian Empire were required to take surnames. Now, of course, some families already had surnames, and some rabbinic dynasties have family trees of greater or lesser veracity, some even stretching back allegedly to Spain or even to King David. But we are looking at Ashkenazim in the 19th and 20th century, because it was only at the beginning of the 19th century, really, that people were adopting surnames, and we could start to know who they are. We are looking at Sephardim principally in the 17th and 18th centuries. We can go back further, but it gets, we can go back earlier, but it gets challenging because the Catholic Church didn't universally start keeping records until the 1560s with the Treaty of Trent. And of course there were some parishes that kept records earlier, and their Inquisition and other civil records, but generally speaking, before the 17th century, it gets a bit challenging. But we said 17th and 18th, and of course there is also a 19th and 20th century for Sephardim, but my personal opinion is that by the time we reach the mid 18th century, Sephardic genealogy kind of ceases to be interesting or as interesting as it was. By this date, I think most of the people who are going to leave the peninsula have already left, and the advantages that Sephardic merchants had previously enjoyed, essentially operating in the cracks between the various warring countries, between the Protestants and the Catholics, between the Christians and the Muslims. By the mid 18th century, we see evolutions in financial and economic systems in Europe. We see the British and the French fleets in particular being quite dominant on the seas. And so the advantage enjoyed by Sephardic merchants was removed. It doesn't mean, of course, there weren't still merchants involved in these trades, but they were less important. Also, the Western Sephardic communities were settled in countries where there were good records in the community, and there were good civil records. And to give an example, the very first meeting I ever went to of the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain, I met a lady who was very excitedly telling me that she had traced her family back to the 18th century, which certainly then, for Ashkenazi research, Eastern Ashkenazi research, was a significant achievement. However, I had, thanks to some starting information from my father, been able to trace back to 1730, just using the Bevis Marks records in London. So the point is that once we reach this later period, Sephardic genealogy is not hugely challenging anymore. If we look at the Ashkenazi side, again, my knowledge really starts with the oppression under the Tsarist regime in Russia, And indeed, the reason, my assumption always was that this is why my ancestors left. Only, I think, when I come back now and look at what's going on through the eyes of a Sephardic genealogist, do I question, well, what about the earlier period? Because even if we don't have names and dates, our ancestors, our Ashkenazi ancestors, were still living there. And I was especially informed by the book on the left, Early Modern Jewry, by David Ruderman. And I think there's probably not much in that that's new for the Sephardic researcher, but certainly for me, in terms of Ashkenazi research, I was largely unaware of this large state in Eastern Europe, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, into which Ashkenazi Jews, sort of starting off in the Rhineland in Western Germany, had in large part gradually migrated, and they were treated reasonably well there. They developed institutions, civil institutions that were led by the secular authorities. And as I say, this is history of which I was completely unaware. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was first hammered by the Swedes and others, and then it was partitioned by its greedy neighbors of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. And as a consequence of this, I think the Jewish secular leadership was destroyed. And as we've seen over last decades in the Middle East, once the civil leadership goes, the institutions that remain are the religious leadership. And it seems to me this is why the Ashkenazi community is led by rabbis, whereas perhaps most other Jewish communities have civil leadership. And all of this, as I say, was kind of news to me and informs my understanding of my Ashkenazi ancestors. Equally, if we look on the right, we have a portrait of the French writer Stendhal, and he was part of Napoleon's Grande Armée, who invaded Russia in 1812. And Stendhal wrote a diary entry in a town, Mariupol, where some of my ancestors were certainly living 60 years later. And it's entirely possible that they were living in that town at that time. If not, they were almost certainly living in that area, and presumably Napoleon and his army marching past was one of the biggest things ever to have happened in their lifetimes. And yet this hasn't or hadn't informed my my Ashkenazi research at all. It was all about names and dates. We're going to very quickly look at resources for genealogy. I mean, we've said that the Sephardic genealogist, the Western Sephardic genealogist, is blessed with data. And here's an example. So this is the nephew of my ancestor, David. This is his Portuguese Inquisition processo. Processo is just a file, all the Inquisition notes. And Miguel, he lived with my ancestor he was born in Valladolid in Spain. He lived with my ancestor in Amsterdam, was picked up by the Inquisition in Brazil, and burnt alive in Lisbon 300 years this year. And his processo has 707 pages. And in this, we learn his genealogy, his life story, his views on religion, various statements he made, various statements made about him, people's opinions of him. We have links to other processos of relatives and people he knew. So the point is, we know an enormous amount about this guy who lived 300 years ago. Indeed, I would suggest that I know more about him than I know about my own grandparents, who I knew personally. And this is a fairly, I think, typical situation within Sephardic genealogy, which is largely, almost exclusively virtual. That's to say, we rely on online databases, and we are fortunate both in the volume of data and that the data is largely scanned. And we'll just quickly mention some of the sources, especially for any Ashkenazi genealogist watching. And I'll use images from the places because they're more fun than just showing documents. So the Amsterdam City Archives has the massive archives of the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, which through Ton's tutelage especially has been opened up to other researchers. And they also have the, I think, 20 million pages of the Amsterdam notarial archives. Also, I should add that through the Nação Hebraica project that David Silveira spoke about, I think on the 8th of January, we're now making these records will become more accessible to everybody. That project is obviously on the Bevis Marks accounts books of London. So the London Metropolitan Archives holds the originals of those accounts books and the records of the London Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community, which is significant but much smaller than Amsterdam. And many of these records are now being digitized by the National Library of Israel. And yet another resource at the Torre do Tombo, which is this not totally attractive building, I think, is on the campus of the University of Lisbon. It's part of the Portuguese National Archives. Portugal has one of the most complete archives of any country in Europe, and they have been extremely good at digitizing, especially the Inquisition records. In time, of course, we will also be looking much more, I think, at church records. So we've described an enormous volume of data for our Sephardic research. When I look at my Ashkenazi research, and I have to be clear, I'm an amateur, so if you're a more serious Ashkenazi researcher, I do apologize about my simplicity. But my Ashkenazi research is largely looking through lists that have been put together or curated by others on platforms like Jewish Gen or Ancestry.com. And whilst, yes, I'm also, of course, looking at newspapers and civil records and some other resources as well, there is just not the volume of data to put meat on the bone as we have with the Sephardic research. If we look at the focus of research, and we've just had Holocaust Memorial Day, I would say in terms of Ashkenazi genealogy, the Holocaust is one of the two main focuses. And I'll share something personal. A couple of days before my father died, and he knew he was dying, he was reminiscing on his life. And he was saying that as far as he was concerned, the Holocaust was the most significant thing that had happened in his life, and he thought perhaps the most significant event ever. And remember, of course, that we're an Anglo-Jewish family, so our immediate family was, thank God, safe from the Nazis. But I think even in England, there were effects. So, for example, my grandparents, my father's parents, took in 3 Kindertransport children from Dortmund in Germany, and their parents didn't survive the war. My Polish-born great-grandmother, after a while, not a very long while, the letters from Poland ceased arriving. And I have to say, I don't even know the names of the Polish relatives. And this is one of the reasons I've kept away from Ashkenazi genealogy to date, because I just feel there's like death waiting for me there, and haven't wanted to touch it. And actually, immediately after the Second World War, my grandfather, who he'd served in the First World War and Second World War, he was quite involved in the British food distribution policy. And he went to the Netherlands very shortly after the war ended with money and some food. And of course, Britain still had rationing, but there was, I think, quite a catastrophic situation in the Netherlands. And he was trying to locate some of the people there that he did business with, some of his suppliers. So a Jewish firm, and of course they didn't come back either. So I think the Holocaust hangs over Ashkenazi genealogy, and I was thinking whilst preparing this talk, well, why not the same with Sephardic? And I came to the rather awful conclusion with talking about Western Sephardim, that those communities that were worst affected, places like Hamburg and Bordeaux and Bayonne, essentially nobody came back to remember them, because the Western Sephardic diaspora we have today is mostly either from the London community or from the Amsterdam community, but so many generations away that there was no real contact there. And perhaps we need to take it on to ourselves to memorialize and remember these lost communities. So I think the second focus of Ashkenazi genealogy is this migration, a single great migration, I think, as Americans would say, from the old country to the new country. And of course, this was not exclusively Ashkenazi. So we have sort of Mizrahi and Eastern Sephardim doing the same, and sort of Irish and Germans and Italians and Poles and Swedes and so forth. But I think this is a defining thing in the Ashkenazi Jewish genealogy community, remembering, of course, that this is largely an English-speaking community. So that's to say, those communities, that community is the descendants of people who did the migration, whereas perhaps Jewish genealogists in Russia or Ukraine whose families stayed there might take a different view. So if that's the focus of Ashkenazi genealogy, what about Sephardic? And I think a lot of us start off with this fantasy that we'll be able to trace back to the expulsion and Ferdinand and Isabella. And I think a lot of fantasists probably have traced back to Ferdinand and Isabella, but for most of us, it's impossible or nearly impossible. So, I mean, what else? And we speak quite a lot about the Inquisition, but the Inquisition was an institution that existed for hundreds of years. So it's not exactly a particular point. And I think the same can be said about sort of normative Jewish communities to which people moved afterwards. And I've rather sort of reached the conclusion that Sephardic genealogy hasn't really got a particular focus. It's just this sort of continuum, and we'll perhaps talk about that in a little bit more detail as we go forward. But in terms of geography, as we've said, it seems to me in Ashkenazi we're looking at one big journey, so that my ancestors, for example, started off in Lithuania. I have no idea whether they took a boat from the Baltic or a train across Germany or the Netherlands or Belgium and whatever. I suspect they arrived somewhere like Hull in the northeast of England and took a train across to Manchester in the northwest. And I have no idea if their original intention was to go on to America or just to stay in England. But essentially what we're seeing with Ashkenazi migrations is people are just rolling the dice, hoping for a better life. And this is one single migration. And so here's a little map showing where Miguel de Mendoza Valladolid was during his life. And so we know he was born in Spain, that he went to the Netherlands. According to the Inquisition proceso, he was working at various points in both France and Portugal. He went to Brazil, and also Uruguay was then part of Brazil. We know he spoke English, so possibly he'd visited England. We just don't have a record of that. And who knows, maybe he visited what's now Belgium as well. So the point is, here is somebody in the early modern period scooting around the planet. And I think this is fairly typical of a Western Sephardic person of that period. So again, if we just take my ancestor David, he was born in Spain. He went to the Netherlands. We don't know how he got there, presumably through France or Portugal, and died in England. Very likely he had been a soldier before he was teaching fencing. And in that case, if he was in the Spanish army, he may well have been in Italy. We just don't know. And these are fairly pedestrian travels compared to many members of the community. So we're looking at a totally different structure. I mean, what these people are doing is perhaps a more modern form of travel rather than just one big move. Obviously, a difference is in terms of language. For Western Sephardim, we're principally relying on Portuguese, which is, I think, good news for a lot of us, because certainly English speakers, most of us have learned Spanish or French in school, and Portuguese is close enough, whereas Ashkenazim have to deal with Slavic and Germanic languages, which for me anyway is more difficult. And I just wanted to also quickly look at who is actually in the research community we have now, and I would draw your attention especially to the estimated figures below, and these are fairly wild, or not wild estimates, but estimates that I've made that I can't verify. I would estimate that in terms of Sephardic genealogy, we have about 10,000 people who are broadly interested in the subject, and I get to that figure by looking at the membership of the Sephardic diaspora group on Facebook, my own social media, and the mailing list of the Sephardic Genealogical Society, obviously realizing there's going to be quite a lot of overlap between those. And my estimate of Ashkenazi, and in America, I think Ashkenazi and Jewish genealogy are used as synonyms, so we can do the same here. I've estimated 200,000. That may be a severe underestimate, I don't know. But even if it is, it's still 20 times larger than the Sephardic figure. The largest that we have data for, largest property within Ashkenazi genealogy is the Jewish genealogy portal on Facebook, which has over 60,000 members. It's followed by Tracing the Tribe, which is somewhat smaller. Tracing the Tribe obviously has a significant place in the evolution of Sephardic genealogy, insofar as it was an academic, a Sephardic academic expert on the liturgy being kicked out of that group that was the catalyst for forming the Sephardic diaspora group and having our own space. And I think I can't quite remember why he got kicked out. Normally it's to do with claims of so-called crypto-Judaism or Jews in or Sephardim in Eastern Europe, but I just don't know. On a more positive note, the International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies, which perhaps some felt has generally in the past treated Sephardic genealogy as light entertainment, has significantly evolved, and we now see a Sephardic researcher on the board, Jarrett Ross, the genie vlogger, and we now have two Sephardic associate members, the Sephardic Genealogical Society and Serena Roffe's Sephardic Heritage Foundation, and she uses Sephardic in the broader umbrella sense, including Mizrahim. So So I think that's good. And again, I think Avatenu used to be a bit sniffy about Sephardim, but certainly the Avatenu DNA project, which all three principles are either Sephardic or seriously Sephardically connected or involved. The Avatenu DNA project is a significant and very valuable part of the Sephardic research community. And last of all, we have Jewish Gen, with which I don't know the history there, but I think it wasn't terribly happy. And that was why a separate Sephardic Gen group was formed. However, again, over recent years, I think thanks to the excellent Avraham Groll, who has taken over there has been a complete sea change in attitude, to the point at which the Sephardic Gen databases are now being incorporated into Jewish Gen, and under circumstances I'm not totally clear about, Jewish Gen have parted company with a crypto Judaism collection, which perhaps was not entirely compliant with genealogical standards. And of course, some of the data there was probably familiar to us from elsewhere. So I wanted to have a quick just compare and contrast of these different worlds. And Sephardic genealogy is necessarily virtual. I mean, at this meeting, we have people scattered throughout the world. And other than, I think, the Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain, 3 times a year, holding a Dutch and Sephardic special interest group, I don't know in the English-speaking world if there is any physical meeting of Sephardic genealogists. Whereas Ashkenazi genealogy was formed around local regional groups, and so pre-COVID, of course, was almost exclusively physical. And I think it's because of this technology that at the moment, I think, and this is just observation, it's not science, I think that the average age of Sephardic genealogists is younger. And I think that's just a feature of the fact that we did start off on social media. So we perhaps have missed the older audience. And I think the average age of Sephardic genealogists will go up, and probably the average age of Ashkenazi genealogists will come down as they are much more on social media. Structure, I'm afraid we haven't really got very much on the Sephardic side, more or less sort of Ton and me sort of running around like headless chickens. But Ashkenazi has, as well as the groups we mentioned, there are a lot of local groups with committees and people who are well informed on their subject. And funding, I'm afraid genealogy is not well funded. I mean, we've I think the Yiddish word is bubkas in terms of Sephardic funding, and Ashkenazi has some, but not vast amounts. I think that, again, the problem with Sephardic genealogy is people coming forward with tales of crypto Jews in Atlantis. I get to get lots of money from excitable people, whereas if we want a bit of money to digitize an archive somewhere, it's less likely to get funding. I think, interestingly, and again, this is just my personal observation, that Ashkenazi genealogy is very heavily, overwhelmingly Jewish people, whereas Sephardic tends to be more mixed. And I think this is just a function of Sephardic communities, Western Sephardic communities living in safe countries for a much longer period. And so we're going to see more intermarriage during that period. And I would also say, in terms of researchers, we also would have academics. And that's, I think, a bit of an achievement, because academics tend to be quite sniffy of genealogy. And in terms of religion, again, I think it's interesting. I would say that Ashkenazi genealogy is it's Jewish but secular, and perhaps even militantly secular. And I think perhaps for some people, and I don't know, but perhaps for some people, genealogy is a way of asserting their Jewish genealogy out of synagogue. I think actually it was perhaps a mistake to use the word affiliated for Sephardic genealogy, because we're not. I think sort of in the zone, so that when we set up the Sephardic diaspora group, we certainly invited rabbis to join the group, because it makes sense, because we are wanting to know both the history of the community and the individuals and who they were, and also the institutions, and most of these institutions still exist. And who better to talk to than the people that still run them? And I think it's a little bit unfortunate that again, when we look at genealogy, certainly in the Ashkenazi side, there's a whole section of the Jewish community missing the Haredi part. I think the Ashkenazi, the Sephardic side is, like any Sephardic community, is a mix, and it's a shame perhaps that the Haredi part is missing, because this is an opportunity for different parts of the Jewish community to do things together. And I think the fact that we have this religious element within the Sephardic side is interesting and useful, and appeals also to our non-Jewish members, because they are here to learn about their ancestors, and that is surely a significant part of their lives. And in terms of style, I mean, I have to say Ashkenazi genealogy is more social. I mean, there's always a chocolate biscuit at the end of the meeting waiting, but of course that's because it's physical, and Sephardic, because it's online, perhaps it is somewhat more formal, and it kind of needs to be, I think, a bit more academic, because we have to operate to standards that are recognized by academics if we are to be treated as equals by them. So what can Sephardic research offer Ashkenazim? I think it goes without saying that Sephardim have benefited from Ashkenazi genealogy. I mean, Sephardic genealogy as a separate entity would not exist had Ashkenazi genealogy not come first and created institutions and spaces. This is very much a personal view, of course, but it seems to me that what Sephardic genealogy is largely about is we are obviously tracking our families, but we're looking at them really, I would say, almost from medievalism to modernity. That's to say, they're not just names and dates. We are following them, and yes, there's also a geographical element, because everybody sort of starts off in the Iberian Peninsula and more or less ends up everywhere except the Iberian Peninsula. But I think what Sephardic genealogy is about very much, and has to be, is we have to understand the history and the culture and the world in which our ancestors were operating. And I think this just makes the whole process, for me personally, I have to say, much more interesting. If I were to apply as I would see it, a Sephardic way of doing things to Ashkenazi genealogy, I apologize, I could only find a Russian language map. This is about dialects of the Yiddish language, and I have to say I had no idea there was both Western, Zapad, and Vostok, so both Western and Eastern dialects, and so I had no idea, like, here we've got a Czech and here we've got a Hungarian. I was better acquainted with the Eastern dialects of Yiddish. So, well, they call it Belarusian, Lithuanian. I would just say Lithuanian. Here we've got Polish, and down here we've got Ukrainian. And these stripy areas are the border lines, where these different dialects merge. But I think it's important, because language is a conveyor of culture. And I think, rather than just saying, well, our ancestors came from this shtetl and got on the boat and went there, I think if we can actually understand who they were and where they came from, and it's possible because, even families after two, three, four generations, very often sort of Yiddish words have come down, be it bagel or beigel or whatever other word. And I just think it's interesting to contextualize our ancestors as we would necessarily do on the Sephardic side. So here is a more sort of tongue-in-cheek map. And the red line is roughly it's the gefilte fish line. So to the east of the line, so especially in Lithuania, gefilte fish, which if you don't know, it's like a fish patty made by ground up carp and other stuff. So in Lithuania, they would put salt in gefilte fish, which was the original ingredient, whereas in Poland, they would put sugar because I think Poland had a big sugar industry, so use it. And I actually have personal experience of this because both my grandmothers were Ashkenazi, and one was Litvak and one was Polak, and so my Ashkenazi one, my Litvak one, would have these salty gefilte fishes, which were just about edible, and the Polish one would have these rather sort of slimy sweet things that I just thought were disgusting. But food is again is an element of the culture and who people were, and I think that's again something that we can include within our studies of Ashkenazi genealogy. I do apologize on these charts. After I made them, I realized I hadn't sourced them. They come from an article, I'm sure. If somebody looks up, they'll find. These show the concentrations of Hasidic leaders by county at 2 points, specifically in the 19th century. The idea being that where the leaders were the concentrations of Hasidic populations. And I think in Sephardic community, and I think studying minhag, the local traditions of the community are very important. And indeed, if somebody is a Western Sephardic, belongs to the Nação Portuguesa, if they're Megrashi from North Africa, Berberisco, if they're Eastern Sephardic from the Ottoman Empire, Levantino, these things all matter. And surely within the Ashkenazi community, if people are Hasidic or Misnagim or whatever they might have been, this is something that is important to them and is something that they will have carried with them when they went abroad, so that when they settled, be it in Manchester or New York or wherever, they would join a synagogue that shares their religious tradition and probably also shares the dialect. Maybe they're landsmen, they come from that sort of area. And now, of course, I don't wish to be patronizing of Ashkenazi researchers, or where I am an amateur, but in my experience, and maybe I just speak for myself, that in the past, many people are just really not looking at this sort of stuff because it doesn't interest them. But this is, I think, absolutely significant and essential for understanding who they were. So I'm afraid you can see I like maps, but these are the last ones. On the right, that rather faded map just shows the Jewish population in Eastern Europe in 1901. The concentrations, and obviously the darker ones, have proportionally more Jews. And the map on the left shows the partitions, the three partitions of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, which in which most of our Eastern Ashkenazi ancestors will have been living. But as I said earlier, I was completely unaware of the existence of this state. It was like my ancestors, had just magically appeared in this sort of Fiddler on the Roof, Yentl sort of world. And I think to understand, I mean, we don't necessarily know before records. We have records of them where they were, but if we can see roughly who took over the territory and when, we can start again to understand more about them. And so I'm afraid that was a fairly rapid canter through the subject, but I just want to give examples of what I think has been done well. And this book, Coin in a Quest, written by Theo Richmond, and probably written some time ago because it was reviewed by the late Jan Morris. What he was doing is exactly the sort of thing that I think is good, and something I think we automatically do with Sephardic genealogy, which is try to understand not just to find the names and dates, but to try to understand the context. And his family came from this Polish town, Konin, which had a big Jewish community. Now, of course, nothing. And he started off by doing some research, and then he got the bug, and so he started interviewing people who were born in that town, and then he actually went to physically visit it, and he built a description and a feel of a living community. And on the right is the Yizkor book, the memorial book for Mariupol, which is the town some of my Ashkenazi ancestors left mercifully years before the Holocaust. But this is a memorial book written by people who survived the Holocaust, and is about memorializing a dead community rather than on the left, I think, celebrating a community that had been living. And I think, again, in the Sephardic genealogy, we are not really we're more concerned about life than just this is a dead culture. This is a place where we were badly treated and we left. We're now happy. Kind of, let's see the end. And so what I'm saying, probably extremely inarticulately, is that what I think, Sephardic genealogy has just gained so much from Ashkenazi. Sephardic genealogy would not exist without Ashkenazi genealogy. But what I hope I can personally do in looking at Ashkenazi genealogy, my Ashkenazi genealogy, is to provide a context, a social context, and a historical context, and a cultural context, rather than just lists of names and dates. But also, what I hope this meeting can show, and I'm sure I'm about to be walloped over the head by lots of people, is that Sephardic and Ashkenazi genealogy, I think, have very substantial differences in terms of the focus of when we study, of the availability of resources. But I think if we can try to better understand a cultural context, we'll get much more out of it. That they're not just names and numbers, but our ancestors are vital human beings, and from whom we can still learn. So I hope that wasn't too much of a narcissistic rant, but I'd be very interested to hear what others have to say, if anyone has anything to say. So
thank you, David, for a spirited talk. And Frances has her hand up since forever.
Shoot me, Frances.
So I grew up between Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities in Manchester after the war, and I grew up mainly with the Sephardi community because they were my relatives from Egypt, and they were noisy, cheerful, and bouncy, and spoke Arabic and French, and not a great deal of English. And I grew up in that atmosphere of noise and actual, what felt like relative freedom. I had loads of friends in the Ashkenazi community in Prestwich. My Sephardi family was in Didsbury, and you saw this total difference. I didn't think about it very hard. It just was real. And they were between the two places, and I moved from one to the other with my father was Ashkenazi, and his family had gone, I've said this before, had gone to South Africa in 1949, in 1939. They went before the Holocaust to South Africa because they saw the trouble coming, the late 19th century, that's right. And so they had gone to South Africa, and some have become raging racists, and some have become fighters for the rights of black people. And so what I saw as a child growing up was extraordinary diversity in both Ashkenazi and Sephardi communities. Now, whether or not the Ashkenazi community and the Sephardi community in Manchester communicated very much, I don't know. I wasn't aware of it. I was moved between them because I had friends in both and very noisy relatives in the Sephardi community. So I think that there's a kind of normality of behaviour of different kinds in both communities. And it was a very, very good growing up, because I learned to shout and bounce about without being embarrassed about it, which was not a very white English thing to do. And so I grew up between cultures in a way I've always been amazingly grateful for. I think that might be all I want to say. The synagogues, yes, the Ashkenazi synagogue and a Sephardi synagogue in Didsbury, completely different places, although the women were separated in the Orthodox synagogue. Sorry, it wasn't a shul, was it? The women were separated, etc., 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 but noisier, more cheerful, more pushy in Didsbury and Withington than it was in Prestwich. But those kind of complicated, I didn't know what I was looking at or what I was in, but I grew up with it and it made an enormous impact on my life. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, I think for Manchester, my Manchester relatives were early arrival Litvaks. I think they established the old Hebrew congregation, and from there looked down on everybody else in a very Western Sephardic way, I suppose. The Sephardic community in Manchester, though, is not Portuguese Jewish,
No.
and I think the thing about the Spanish and Portuguese community of London is really we're more English than the English. Although I have to say, till I went to English boarding school, I just took for granted that everybody had a grandmother who spoke with a Yiddish accent, and it just never occurred to me that that would not be the case. But
I say that I think that's such a diverse growing up. I've always been thankful for it, really, really thankful that it gave me, as you're saying, this kind of broadness, rather chaotic vision.
Yes, yes.
Janet Silverman has her hand.
Janet actually knows what she's talking about.
No. I'm not sure that I do, except where it pertains to my own family. So I was listening to what Francis just said with a great deal of amusement. My family's Ashkenaz, and we are like the noisiest people around. So I think that a lot of what we try to merge together is a conflation, perhaps not only of our Sephardic or Ashkenaz backgrounds, but also the places to which our ancestors moved, where they are in 20th or 21st century. My partner's family, also from an Ashkenazic background, it lived in the Midwest of the US, and they're very, very quiet people. My Ashkenaz family settled in the Northeast, and we are an extraordinarily noisy people all the time. So that's my 2 cents.
I mean, I wonder though if what we're looking at perhaps is my Manchester relatives were uber Litvak, and so, you know, very formal like that, whereas maybe people of Hasidic ancestry were more into sort of having some fun and dancing and hitting the vodka, and that maybe perhaps within the Anglo-Jewish world, we've sort of forgotten, on the Ashkenazi side, sort of forgotten those origins. I don't know, maybe that's just a pretentious point, but
David, I do have a question for you about your Anshel Feingold. Is he the guy who's buried at the Plashet Jewish Cemetery in Eastham?
yeah, yes.
Okay. On Find a Grave, it's impossible to read his father's name on the gravestone, and it's there.
Oh, yes, no, I have that. I went to his grave. I think I was probably the first person to go there and say Kaddish in 50 years. He didn't actually get a gravestone while my great-grandmother was still alive, for kind of obvious reasons. But once she had gone, my grandmother quickly put a gravestone up. But
does it have his father's name on there?
It actually, I don't know if it does actually.
Because the Hebrew's really hard to read on the photograph, but it looks like there's a father's name on there.
Yes, there probably is.
If you could go to the stone and see if there is, and let me know.
Sure. Thank you.
Bernard Meller, you can unmute yourself.
I think I'm unmuted. Okay, first of all, thank you, David. As always, really useful, really helpful, and a fascinating kind of comparison between the two worlds in which a lot of us live. I have to admit that I get so caught up when I discover new Sephardic branches or family members by the ease with which I can then look up stories and history about them, that I kind of give up on my father's Ashkenazi side, which is a lot more work just to find a name or to find a place. But I have a couple of points I wanted to make, a question and a suggestion about maps. First of all, the question, you showed a map about the different places where David Mendoza lived, and it had the countries and the areas picked out in red. And I just wanted to ask if you could tell us what that map is, how you got it, whether it's configurable, because it looks like a really valuable tool. And on the suggestions, I've just pulled up, but I know there are a lot of them, on YouTube, something called 1,000 Years Time-Lapse Map of Europe. And if you put it on and let it play, it shows you over this particular one, 10 minutes, some of them do it in 2 minutes, how the countries changed graphically. So if you're looking for somebody in a particular year, when the map gets to that year, you can see if you have a town or a village name, you can see whether it was in Austria-Hungary, the Russian Empire, Germany, or one of the then smaller countries like Lithuania or Belarus. And I think it's a useful tool for people doing, in fact, both, but particularly Ashkenazi. Obviously, it shows changes in the Iberian Peninsula and Southern Europe, where a lot of our Sephardic ancestors moved around first. The other thing is, you talked about the structure and you said there really isn't much in the way of structure. And I think that's slightly unfair in that for people who at least speak Spanish and or Ladino and or Hakatia, the East Sepharad people who do a weekly talk, and sometimes they have live meetings which are done as mixed media. and the Sunday afternoon grouping Encuentros de Al-Had, which most Sundays are in Ladino, but one Sunday a month are in Haketia. Although they're looking primarily at history and culture, there is an enormous amount of genealogy in their talks. Plus, they're fascinating and full of really interesting stories. And I know that there is a language barrier for people who don't have Spanish. And if you do have Spanish, you effectively know Ladino and Haketia 85 to 90%. So you will be able to follow. But I'm wondering whether it's possible to sort of link up with them to create something more global. So,
well, sorry.
Thanks.
Yes, David.
Yeah, I mean, first thing is I was specifically trying to talk about the sort of Anglosphere and specifically about Western Sephardim and sort of Eastern Ashkenazim. I'm not even sure that's the correct terminology, but yes, you're right about those groups existing. And actually, at the forthcoming International Association of Jewish Genealogical Society, all these Jewish groups have such long names, meeting in London later this year, we're sort of hoping that the various Sephardic and Mizrahi groups that are turning up, we can have some sort of joint meeting. And in terms of genealogy, I think we are already seeing, obviously, between the Western Sephardim and Morocco, this huge overlap, and less so, but perhaps later between Eastern Sephardi, and obviously the Italians as well as the Moroccans, and later so with Eastern Sephardim. So yes, in terms of the map, it's one of those sort of narcissistic maps that you can find about, you know, everywhere I went on holiday, so I can show off to people on social media. It was one of those, but I thought it's quite useful. Yeah.
David, did you find more Mendoza ancestors who intermarried with Ashkenazim, or did it all start with your grandfather?
Oh no, they all did. We have this huge family tree, and I was showing my father, because one of them married a hamburger. So I was showing this to my father. He said they all married hamburgers. But no, I mean, in Britain, I think I mean, you know, if you were to do a pie chart, I'm sure I'm sure I am much more Ashkenazi than I am Sephardi. It's just because I'm on the patrilineal line that you know, the family has continued to go to the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, and halakhically, you know, Judaism flows down the mother's line, but your lineage down the father's line. So it's just that. I mean, like all Anglo-Sephardim, it's just a lot of hypocrisy, to be honest.
When did that intermarrying start?
In the 1790s, somewhere like that, before Moses Montefiore, but because they're poor, they didn't count.
I looked at the Ketubot of Bevis Marx, and I found in 1786 an Abraham Benatar and a Rachel the Isaac Bar Jacob.
Yeah.
Now, Bar gives it away, because when Sephardic sources in Amsterdam and London say Bar, they refer to Ashkenazim. And
yes,
in the same year, there was another marriage between a Sephardic person and an Ashkenazim. But after that, there's a gap, and then it starts again in the 1790s. So that should be a subject that needs a little bit more research. Ali has his hand up.
Yes, sorry, I was going to ask a couple of things, but just going on that on the intermarriage question, I sort of stumbled across some of this in my own research quite recently, and basically, before Moses Montefiore, it was pretty much exclusively something that wealthy Sephardim were able to do, because the Ashkamot specifically forbade anyone going onto the tzedakah list or receiving any kind of benefit if a man of the nation married a Tedesca. And it specifically says that. And I think I certainly seen it in the 1784 update of the Ashkamot, but it may be even earlier. So, that kind of rules out pretty much large bodies of paupers, essentially. But that doesn't mean they didn't. I think probably it happens.
I think so too, that there were marriages that escaped registration because it was between Sephardim and Ashkenazim.
Yeah.
So maybe we can find that at the bottom in the Ashkenazi community, but I'm not familiar with those. Mr. Newman has his hands up.
Sorry, I meant to say something else before that.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. Sorry. The other thing I was going to just ask David is, the Ashkenazi immigration to England, anyway, seemed to take place in a couple of big waves. First of all, I think starting from the beginning of the 19th century and sort of into the 1830s. And then the really big wave came in the 1880s, from the pogroms that were going on in Russia and in Poland at the time. But in that time, I mean, there were so many institutions that were acting to relieve people who had come. They must have kept some records, these soup kitchens and hospitals. The whole British Board of Guardians, I think, was set up for this purpose. So there must be extensive records in England of people and where they came from. And I certainly remember, Kevin may be able to sort of remind me about this, but we looked at a book a lady from the Jewish Genealogical Society had produced of the 1831 census, all the Jews basically in the 1831 census. And it gave quite a lot of detail about where they came from, sometimes just country, but sometimes also places in those countries. So yeah, there's a few things there.
But I think we're talking about different populations, because the earlier settlers here, as of course in the United States, we're looking at sort of Dutch German Jews who were like as horrified as the Sephardim when all these sort of uncouth East Europeans started coming in. I think the difference between Britain and America is that here we had the Board of Deputies, which had already been set up. And I assume actually that it's called, I assume deputies in English just comes from deputados in Portuguese. I never really thought about that before. But that in England, therefore, the Sephardic community was entrenched in the establishment, or indeed as half of the establishment. And so when there was mass immigration into England, what they tried to do was to send people off to provincial towns to avoid some sort of ghetto being formed in London, and basically did everything possible to stop these new arrivals causing embarrassment or upset. Whereas in America, of course, the communities were less well organized, and the sort of tsunami of migrants was so much greater that it didn't really matter. They were just sort of overwhelmed. But I mean, yes, I think there are records, I'm sure, at the London Metropolitan Archives of some of these institutions. But I think we're talking about institutions and soup kitchens and whatever, we're not going to get that much extra real information, except, you know, so when great grandma had to go into the workhouse kind of thing. Whereas, you know, if we're looking at some of these Sephardic records, you know, we're literally knowing when somebody gets called, you know, who's getting called up to the Torah in synagogue, and who's getting how many sacks of coal every, you know, quarter, and so on. As well as this, you know, Inquisition, you know, asking, you know, what you believe about transubstantiation and stuff like this. So it's a completely, qualitatively and quantitatively, it's a completely different thing. Although, yes, I mean, there must be much more Ashkenazi stuff. So a meeting I went to earlier this afternoon, Jewish Genealogical Society of Great Britain, Daniel started off with a slide saying there is much more data than you think, and I'm sitting there thinking, oh God, you know, I'm just about to say the opposite. So so yes, there is, but I think we, on the Sephardic side, there's infinitely more meat to get our teeth into.
Okay. Mr. Newman.
Well, it's really an imposter town, David. It's
oh, hi, yeah.
I'm with my sister and her husband in New York City for the weekend, at a very happy occasion, and bar mitzvah, and a very loud occasion as it was in an Ashkenazic service. So I was reflecting, and this is not going to help us with the genealogy anymore, but I was reflecting with a smile on Francis' comments about the difference between the Sephardic synagogues and the noisy Ashkenazic ones. And I was wondering whether the noisy Ashkenazi were quiet at home, and the quiet and dignified gravitas of a Spanish Portuguese synagogue meant that they had to take it out at home with extra noise. Maybe that's a reflection that that was the way they dealt with the problem. But in all seriousness, I think I got one big takeaway from you, David, and that was the fact that we have the synagogues, at least after the Inquisition, the synagogues organized by the members of the community and by the Mahamad in our case, they kept these wonderful records, whereas the synagogue run by rabbis did not necessarily keep that level of detailed records. And so you reflect on that. So the advantage is you've got the records. On the other hand, the rabbi doesn't have the authority that they have in an Ashkenazi community. I just those are kind of my takeaways, and I just had a smile thinking about Francis's comments.
Yeah, I think Francis though is talking more about an Eastern Sephardic tradition, whereas we're Western. So I hope you were sitting there and trying to shush everybody into a state of decorum. But Mazal Tov anyway.
Happy that. Kevin Martin in a post in chat tracks attention to the numerical differences between Ashkenazim and Sephardim. Ashkenazim grew from 500,000 in 1750 to 11 million in 1900. Well, Sephardim seem to have stagnated or even went back in numbers. Can you reflect on that?
Well, I mean, not if you believe the crypto-Judaism movement, where we're breeding faster than bunny rabbits. The latest figure I saw, and it's like Moore's law, it just sort of doubles every year exponentially. The latest figure I saw is from the Jewish Heritage Alliance, I think they're called. It says up to 600 million. And so they're kind of going to run out of Latin Americans quite soon, I think. I'm not quite sure what they do next, but yeah, I think well, I don't really know. I mean, is it the fact that as populations get wealthier and more urbanized, they have less children, and also I think within the Jewish community, along with that, they marry out faster. I don't know. I mean, it's funny. It's like the projects that we're discussing with Bruce. Once we have the data, we may be able to work out. But I mean, surely richer urbanized people have less children, and the Sephardim were in that state before the Ashkenazim. And I don't know also though whether if you're living in large cities in the 17th, 18th, 19th century, and Sephardi, you're going to have a die faster because the insanitary conditions, because if that's where Sephardim were living and Ashkenazim were living more in villages. But I don't know. It's a really interesting question. I don't know. I don't know the answer. Is the honest truth.
Personally, I think there may be an answer in at what age you marry. The younger you marry, the more children you are able to have.
Yeah.
And this is a phenomenon overall in Western society, not only Jews. Well, in the 18th century, people married at age 25. In the 19th century, it became something like 18 or 19. So they had automatically more children during their marriage. And this is one explanation for the population explosion in the 19th century. So what we would need is also data about marriage and at what age that happened. It could explain a lot.
But is later marriage though also a function of wealth and female education, which again one assumes would be faster in the Sephardic?
But it could also be a method of limiting the number of children you have. So
yes.
A very conscious decision to marry late reflects the wish to have fewer children during your marriage. But, yes. Well, we need more data on Jewish marriages for that.
Could also be that Sephardic services are so slow and go on so long that nobody had the opportunity to procreate.
That's very speculative.
Yes.
I think this meeting has gone on too long.
Yes, it has.
So we leave people to have more children.
Okay.
And we, as always, we thank our patrons who are all with us here, and our viewers on YouTube, if there are any. And we hope to see you all next week.
Thank you.